It's so great traveling through the state of Mississippi. Auditor Shad White, by the way, is our guest. Thanks for coming in today,
Good to see you. Yeah.
But I know you travel around the state as well. We're so blessed with such a beautiful, great state. And this time of year in particular, the trek from here to Greenville is a couple of hours, but it's beautiful to do that. I mean, God blessed us for sure.
That's right. I'm headed up that way on Wednesday. I'm headed south today, and then headed up to Tupelo on Friday too. And yeah, you do some of these drives, and it's amazing. There are days when I don't want to be out walking in it, but we have some beautiful drives.
We really do. So you're going to Tupelo. Are you going to go up the Trace for any part of that?
That's a good question. There's no easy way to get to
really
Tupelo,
not.
right? Yeah. No. So the Trace is if we're taking it easy that morning. Yeah. I think I got some meetings up there, and I'm speaking to Kiwanis or something like that.
The last couple of times I've gone north on 55, 82. Cut over and then hopped on the Trace.
That's not bad either.
About 45 miles on the Trace.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. Don't get broken down on the Trace. I almost did that one time. Truck started stuttering in the middle of a rainstorm with no cell phone coverage at all. And so I ended up calling. This was several years ago. I ended up calling my dad, and I said, "This is where I am. If you don't hear from me in 20 minutes, get on the Trace and start driving." I made it back somehow. My truck made it, but it was touch and go for a minute. Touch and go.
Well, I kid you about this all the time, but you're too busy down there. Too busy cracking these fraudsters.
Yeah.
I want you to be the Maytag repairman. I know I've shared that with you before, but
it would be nice to not be busy.
I know. I agree.
We've been busy.
Just do audits.
Yeah.
But you can't, because every time you get in there an audit, somebody thinks they can outsmart the system. And you end up finding all sorts of impropriety.
Yep.
And you got to take action. And I've always been a fan of your attitude towards that, which is don't really care what that might mean and what they may think of you or the office or the system or whatever. Yep. It's law. Right is right. Wrong is wrong. And that's what we're going to do here.
Yep. And I think people see that. I was coming back from the National State Auditors Association conference last week, which is exactly as exciting as it sounds. And I actually like it a lot because we get a chance as auditors to sit around the same table and discuss the best audits from this past year, the most complicated ones, the ones that turned up the biggest fraud, the biggest crime. It's a really good environment to be in. But I was coming back from this conference. I was in Atlanta in the airport, and somebody came up to me and said the same exact thing, and they were talking about one of the cases that we had, and I could tell that they had read a ton about this case, very interested in it, and said the same point that you just made, Gerard, that it's really important that people feel like the law is the law regardless of who it is, and if it's somebody famous or if it's not, if it's somebody who is very well connected or somebody who's not, that the standard is going to be the same for everybody. And that's the message that I'm trying to put. So it's gratifying when people come up to you in the airport, even in Georgia, and say, "Hey, read about some of the stuff you're doing. Thank you for that."
Consistency is the hallmark of principle. There is no principle without consistent application of the standards and of the principle.
That's right.
And financial standards, audit standards, I mean, they're pretty well established. It ain't that hard. As far as we don't make the stuff up as we go along, you're just adhering to well-established standards and law, of course, which is what dictates all this.
And I remember my first year in office, this was a wake-up call, because I had that baked into my set of values before I walked into the auditor's office. But I remember in my first, year and a half or so, we back-to-back had mid-sized cases against a Democratic supervisor in a blue county, and then right behind that had a similar-sized case against a Republican supervisor in a very red county, back-to-back. And, it was as if on social media everybody was mad simultaneously. and in my mind I thought that's a sign that we're doing the exact right thing. Right. And you know what? If at the end of it all those people stay mad at me and I get to the end of my time as state auditor, I will at least know that I did the job the right way.
Exactly right.
And then I'll go back to the house and find the next thing to do or whatever it may be. But I also tend to think that there's this huge group of largely silent taxpayers who are not spending their time, on Twitter every 5 seconds complaining about an audit that we did, who see the news about this stuff and they're grateful that somebody is holding everybody accountable equally, Democrat, Republican, rich, poor, connected, not, all that.
They just don't say anything about it, and that's fine. They don't necessarily weigh in and offer their commentary. Unfortunately, it's always those people that are bent out of shape on either side in a situation. That's usually the ones who are most vocal.
Welcome to politics.
Absolutely. I get it. So, all right. So you have published, your office has recently, a crime cost report. And that had some rather sobering data in it with respect to what it costs taxpayers to just deal with crime.
That's right. So, we've read about the crime wave that's happening in Jackson specifically in the last year and a half or so. Jackson was the per capita leader in homicides for any major metro area in the entire country last year. Homicides are still up this year. It's a tragedy reading about these. 5-year-old girl killed just in the last few days. So you read about these stories, and the stories of the victims and their families hurt your heart. But we also wanted to make the point that there is a cost to the taxpayers for all these homicides as well, and that's where I come in as state auditor. It is my job not just to audit public money, not just to put a stop to fraud, but also to tell taxpayers when their money is being misspent, misallocated, wasted, spent on things that we don't have to spend money on.
Sure.
So we did a literature review of the cost of crime around the Southeast. We pulled cities like Baton Rouge, Mobile, Orlando, Florida, even as far away as Orlando, and started looking at what homicides cost those cities. And what we were able to get down to is that the typical homicide in a city like Jackson costs taxpayers anywhere from $900,000 per homicide to $1.2 million per homicide. The way you get to a number that big is think about the crime scene. You've got to investigate the crime scene. You've got to make an arrest if you can find somebody, so you got to pay for the law enforcement officers. You've got to clean the crime scene. If the victim has to go and have medical care, emergency medical care before they pass away, we're probably going to pay for a little bit of that. If we catch somebody who's committed murder, we're going to have to adjudicate their case through the system, so we're going to have to prosecute them. The judge's time has to be paid for, the prosecutors. Then if they get convicted, we got to put them in jail and keep them there, right? So when you add all that stuff up, you're talking about a pretty big cost to the taxpayers. In 2021, if you wanted to try to summarize the cost to the taxpayers of just the homicides that happened in Jackson, Mississippi, you're talking about a number up around $180 million just for the homicides in the city of Jackson. So that shows you that we've got a big cost associated with this violent crime, and it's going to do us some good to stop the violent crime, not just for the victims, not just for the families, but also for the taxpayers more generally.
And I know in this particular report, I believe you focused on violent crime and homicides in particular. But, I've often thought the same thing, Auditor, about just avoidable car crashes, for example.
Bingo.
It costs a lot of money to deal with that. And if you're on your dang phone or you're inebriated or anything else, that's an unforced error. I mean, accidents, sure, they happen. That's why we all have insurance. That's why we pay our taxes for law enforcement and so forth to manage that and deal with that. But if, you're doing 100 miles an hour down the road and the speed limit's 70, you're at higher risk. I mean, statistically, that's just the truth. Or anything else you may be engaged in that's just gross negligence. Well, we're all having to pay for that.
That's right. And you and I we're data guys, right? So when we think about these problems, I think it's important to be able to speak to research about how big the problem is. How much would we save if we prevented that preventable car crash or if we prevented that homicide? And we can quantify it in terms of dollars, but we can also quantify the cost of violent crime in terms of lives.
Sure.
So one thing the report points out is if you hire another 100 additional police officers and put them on the street, that, according to research, equates to between 6 and 10 prevented homicides per year. Okay. So that shows you that not only is it a tragic waste of taxpayer resources when you see homicides, but there's a better way to use those resources, and it's law enforcement. That's one of the most robust findings in social science. More police officers equals less crime. More police officers equals less crime. Liberals love to point out, or claim at least, that they're the ideology of science, right? Conservatives don't want to think about science. They're the ones who rely on studies for all their views. They don't like talking about studies when it means more police officers on the ground. They don't like talking about studies when those studies suggest that fathers are important in households to teach their kids discipline. Those are the kinds of things, honest conversations about real studies that can show us a pathway forward on these tough issues like violent crime.
In fact, they don't like anything that conflicts with their ideological agenda.
Oh, I know.
Rather than trying to actually solve problems.
Oh, I know.
And improve the quality of life and the standard of living. And they just don't want to hear it because, unfortunately, they derive power from their ideology.
That's right.
And they got a lot of people fooled, I think.
I think that's right, too.
I hope people are waking up. We got a break. You can hang around with us?
Yes, sir. Let's do it.
We got Auditor Shad White in the Element Well studios. We'll come right back. Stay with us. Auditor Shad White is our guest.
I appreciate the Foo Fighters lead in, too. That's straight from my generation, speaking my language.
So, pivot a little bit. First of all, appreciate you putting that report together showing the cost of crime to taxpayers.
Sure.
So there's obviously an economic cost, and then there's a non-economic cost. It's bad all the way around. But and I've often thought, gee, if we didn't have all of this money and all of this sort of Byzantine bureaucracy involved in just managing the process of crime, processing crime, how much wealthier we would be.
Yes.
It's just true. And you dug into it a little bit. Then we send them off and incarcerate them, and that costs an arm and a leg as well. And we're constantly playing catch-up to get staff and assets and other resources we need. Of course, now you're aware the DOJ is looking at Parchment, and that's an issue that we got to deal with there. But something that's come up here recently that's started to hit me, and I know you're not in the process of making law and appropriating money.
Sure.
But you will be digging into the financial statements at the agency level, which is what your office is charged with. I'm starting to worry a little bit about our income, about our revenue. I mean, generally speaking, if we're dropped into a recession, less economic activity means less revenue to the state. And I'm not trying to be an alarmist here, but lawmakers need to be concerned about this, I think.
Sure. Well, think about inflation, too. You were talking about spending and inflation before I got on the air. You know, what we know is that some of the revenue that we've received as a state is at least in part driven by the federal government printing unprecedented amounts of money. And we've really been doing it since 2008. We've really been doing it since the 2008 financial crisis. You know, the Fed has printed a lot of money through what they call quantitative easing. So that's a ton of money being pushed out into the system through monetary policy. And then, of course, Congress is spending unprecedented amounts of money, or at least it did through the pandemic. And so, that money is flowing around. It has to chase certain goods, and it eventually comes back, usually in the form of tax revenue to state and local government. So, those numbers are going to be high. Now, what happens when all of this kind of dies down a little bit? What happens if the Fed tightens interest rates? What happens if Congress is not spending in as extreme an amount as they were during COVID? You're going to see some effects, some downstream effects from this money being cut off. And I'll paraphrase, I guess, Warren Buffett. You know, when the tide is high, it's hard to tell who's swimming naked. And then when the tide goes down, all of a sudden, every time the tide goes down, now you know who's swimming naked. What that means financially is when there's money flying around, especially in government, there's a big temptation to steal, right? And it can happen. And then when the money goes down a little bit, sometimes that happens to make it easier to uncover some of this fraud. Person A is stealing money, $100,000, let's say this past year. It goes unnoticed because the budgets of a state or local economy are really high, so nobody's paid attention to the fact that they're missing $100,000. If the budget craters a year from now, they need that $100,000. People start asking hard questions about where all the money's gone, and now you see that somebody's been swimming naked. The tide has gone down, and so that's part of my concern as state auditor. The legislature is going to have to figure out how they spend money, how they avoid overspending. But as auditor, I have to figure out, okay, what does all this money flying around mean, and then how do we respond to it if revenue is curtailed later on down the road? And
let me be clear, I was a proponent of tax reform and eliminating the income tax, at least on a phased-in basis. And I still am a proponent of that. But I'm just saying that if I were a lawmaker, I'd be doing some research on that, on this, and I'd be talking to the state economists, and I'd be sort of taking stock of the overall macroeconomic environment. It looked no further than the federal government, which is now receiving record revenues, and the Treasury says we're not exactly sure why. I mean, how can you say that? How can they not? And this is with the Trump tax cuts that all the liberals told us were going to break us if we passed them, and we're having record revenues.
I'm a fan of tax cuts too, and I think that they do a lot to generate economic growth in the economy, which is really important. To me, the place you start if you see revenues tailing down, you start with cutting costs. Okay, so let's have some hard conversations if we think that revenue is going down in the next 2 years, about where we can save money inside government. Because I'm a conservative. When I walked in the state auditor's office, I believed that there was waste in government that could be found and eliminated. But now, having done this job for 4 straight years, I can tell you unequivocally there's a lot of waste in government. And, yeah, we need to do a lot more work to curtail that waste. Every single audit that we produce shows some sort of misspending, some sort of waste. And people, if they get bored, can go on our website and read all these. I talk about them a lot, too. But that's to me the big takeaway from my time working in the auditor's office that doesn't relate to criminal cases. It's how much waste there is in state government and how easy it is to ignore the waste and just let it keep running. Let it keep running because nobody is asking hard questions. Let's ask some hard questions. Let's figure out where the waste is because we're going to need to when the tide goes down a little bit.
I just want to see them work together and not be antagonistic about, dug in on any issue on any side whatsoever of the issue, but rather let's really take a hard look at our overall fiscal situation and just make sure that we're properly handling that. Also, the good news is our rainy day fund is flush.
That's great.
So,
that's great.
Which was a good move on the part of our legislature, and I think there was the broad consensus on that to do that. Never been any debate or argument about that. But it's just something to at least take stock of and think about. Now, my experience in operating a business in Mississippi is that when you see these really wild economic swings, either down or up, usually we don't go to the extremes because we have a fairly diverse economy. Has been my take on it. Of which, 39% of it or so is ag business. And that's fairly static, fairly stable. So it's not like we have such a reliance on a particular industry that experiences a downturn that it really hurts the state.
That's right.
So that's the good news for us. The bad news is maybe we don't quite participate at the level of some other states when we have really sharp increases of economic activity. Yeah, we don't have that, but we also don't have the downturns on the other side. So. And I think we're in good shape in that we're having record revenues. Like I said, we've got the rainy day fund all flush with money as high as it can be in accordance with statute. But we still just need to be aware that there's headwinds. And all the analysts I'm hearing this morning are saying the downturn in the market we're seeing, and now down 600-something points, they don't see this as capitulation day. They still think we got some more downside to come. And who knows what the Fed's going to do, and that also could affect. The good news is we're not issuing bonds. We're not having to borrow money to the way we were, and we're going to see some interest rate increases, and that affects our borrowing costs.
That's right. Yeah, and two, some of these things we can't control here in Mississippi. We can't control the Fed. To a limited extent, we can control Congress, but not all that much, right?
Yeah.
So I like to think about the things we can control and what that's going to do to our tax revenue, our future as a state. Let's talk about one thing we can control, or at least try, crime. So at the end of that crime report that we were talking about, we not only discussed the cost to the taxpayers of homicides, we discussed the indirect economic costs, and a lot of these are just common sense. There's research to back it up, but they're also common sense. When murders go up in an area, tax revenue goes down, right? So we may not be able to control an international economic contraction, but let's make sure we get our own house in order in terms of crime so that our revenue stays as high as possible. I had somebody tell me the other day, well, of course crime is high in Mississippi on a per capita basis because we don't have that many people, and we're a small state. And I said, you ever looked at the crime rate of Iowa? You ever looked at the crime rate of West Virginia? Another small state, few people, high poverty rates in West Virginia. They're doing way better than we are. And the reason we're doing poorly is our capital city. Yep. Hinds County routinely leads the state in homicides when you compare county to county. And it's hurting the state's overall metrics. The CDC has said that Mississippi has the highest number of deaths per capita due to homicide of any state in the entire country in their most recent data. So let's focus on some stuff that we can control. And when we're starting to worry about tax revenue in the future, one way to get at that problem is to make sure that people feel safe so that they can go out and spend some money, so that they can go hire, so that they can do all the things that make an economy go. We know that housing prices go down when crime goes up. Not complicated, but it's backed by research. We know based on research that uses gunshot geolocation that businesses are 7.5% more likely to fail when gunshots in a neighborhood go up. So we know all these things are going to affect us in the long run. We got to get serious about them.
And all that figures into our revenue.
Bingo.
At the state.
Bingo.
You got to go. You hang around.
I got to shoot.
Go?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm headed on the road next.
I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for coming in.
It's good to see you.
You bet. Auditor Shad White has been our guest here in the Element Wealth Studios. We'll come right back.